Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Sidney Sachs, and today I'd like to welcome Benjamin Terner. Thank you very much for coming. And he's going to talk to us about writing your family history stories. Not so much genealogy, it's just your immediate family stories. And tell me what you do and how you got into this.
Well, back in 1972, my parents had a 50th wedding anniversary, and I wanted to do something special for that occasion. So I interviewed my mother for a couple of hours separately, and then I interviewed my father for a couple of hours, and I took furious notes on my legal pad, and I put them together, and I got a very interesting story of their 50 years, but to read them separately, you wouldn't have known that they were married.
Did they each emphasize different things?
Yeah, they talked about different things. My mother talked about a lot of the social events and during their marriage, and my father talked a lot about business matters because he was a businessman, and his family was involved in business, so those things were most important to him.
Well, that also shows you exactly what's important to each of the individuals as they make their life. So what is it now? You teach a class at the Jewish Community Center in Maryland?
I teach a class right now at the Revitz House, and I'm going to start teaching on February 1st.
Now what is that, a retirement home, the Revitz House?
Yeah, that's an independent living center in Rockville, Maryland. And I'm going to start teaching the same course at the Ring House, which is another big senior citizen independent living center. And the classes, I've been doing these classes for about 10 years. And I have a lot of fun with them. I really enjoy it.
So people come to this not knowing what to write down or how to write it. I certainly, even though I've done genealogy for years, I don't know how to start writing about myself or writing down my own family history.
Well, most of the people that come to my class are not really genealogists, but they're interested in leaving their story behind for their family, and they're in their 70s and 80s. I have one student that's in his 90s, and he's one of my best students. And once they get started, they seem to really get into it. Some of them come back to the class 2 or 3 years till they keep writing more stories, and some just come for 1 year. But I've gotten to know them pretty well, and they have interesting stories to tell, as everyone does. Telling a good story is something very special, and there's no secret to it. You have to have an introduction. You have to tell what your subject is. Then you have to develop the characters that are part of the story. And finally, you have to sort of conclude with a punchline or maybe just a sort of summary statement. And once you structure it, it makes it a lot easier. And the hardest thing for most people, and for me, is just to get started. And I find that by preparing these topic sheets, that I've really been able to get people started.
I'm sure you can't see this on the screen, but I'm going to hold it up anyhow. You have a table of contents of the types of things that you're going to cover. You talk is this like each one a different session? You'll talk about my mother and my father and grandmother and grandfather?
Each one is a separate session. And then I've mixed in some, in addition to members of the family, I've mixed in some things to create the atmosphere of your family, like music in my family, and how my family weathered the Great Depression of 1929, and my old neighborhood and how it changed, and celebrating the holidays with our family. And these things fill in a lot of blanks. But the basic part of the course deals with family members and telling everything that you know about the important family members, those that had an impact on you.
So then when you talk about your mother, it'd be like, what kind of a person was your mother? Or
what were some of the activities you shared with your mother? Was your relationship with your mother a positive relationship? Can you describe your mother's appearance? That always helps. And some people are better at that than others. But if you have a photograph, you can sometimes sit down, look at the photograph, and describe the person in a way that helps to make them come alive.
I think I would have a great deal of difficulty. They have 2 eyes and a nose and a mouth.
Well,
I'm not very...
Are they short or are they stout? Are they, you know, what do they look like when somebody comes into the room, you know, and you say, wow, now there's a good-looking woman. You know, those things...
I think you can only think of your parents as being old. I don't know,
Well, my parents never seemed old to me, actually, even when they were, because my father was so active and my mother was almost as active as my father. So they were always in and out, doing things. My older sister was assigned to take care of me often. There were 3 children in my parents' family, and I was the middle one. So my eldest sister, who was 6 years older, would take care of me. And because my mother was so busy doing this and that, yet she was always home to cook a good dinner, and to do the laundry, and to keep the house warm and friendly. So I never look at my parents as old.
Yeah.
In fact, my mother lived to be 99.
Woo! Okay.
And I really missed her when in 1998 when she died.
Well, that's quite an age. So, what are some of these other things that you've brought? Did you have a sample that you wanted to read, or something that the people had brought? Yeah,
I usually at the beginning of the class, I prepare a schedule of the classes and tell a little bit about what we try to do. And I say that everyone has a story to tell. When were you born? What is your Jewish name? Who were you named after? Who are your parents and grandparents? How did they earn a living? What was their ancestral town or shtetl? You may not know a lot of detail about your family history, but what you do know will be of interest to other members of your family. And the way you tell your story will be different than the way some other member of the family would tell it.
Do you find most people have a lot of photographs and things to add to it?
Quite a few. Quite a few of the students have certificates, graduation diplomas, some have immigration papers. A number of my students emigrated themselves, and they'll bring those into the class.
Do you end up having them create a book like that when they're all finished?
Well, at the end of the class, we give them a notebook, and it has all their stories in it. And then the Jewish Historic Society of Greater Washington is interested in archiving this material, and they present each student with a certificate. So that's always a highlight, we have a little graduation ceremony. This is...
now that's your own.
This is my own collection of family history stories, and also includes all the family tree charts. And there are 18 stories that I've written, and I often use some of those stories to inspire my class members. I try to make the stories interesting and very readable, and some of them have a little bit of humor attached. And the class members really seem to like very much hearing my stories. But this year, they stopped me and they said, you know, you've written all these stories about your mother and your father and your grandmother and your grandfather, but we don't know that much about you. And they want me to write my biography. And I hadn't thought of really doing that, but they mentioned it in a couple of classes. You should write your biography, Ben. So I've started on my biography.
Well, that should be interesting, too.
I also have a few samples, fairly short stories that
Maybe you can summarize them, because it's sort of deadly just to read something.
Well, that's true. Of course, even if they're short, sometimes I'm looking for a real short one. Yes. This is only 2 paragraphs.
Okay.
It's called The Melody Lingers On. And this story was written by Libby Elson, who was one of my favorite students. She said, I have 2 sons. Norton, the eldest, is in his early 50s. Clifford, the youngest, is 49. They're both doctors. When they were boys of preschool age, I used to put them to sleep, and while sitting on the foot of their beds, I would sing them a lullaby. When they were asleep, I used to put out the lights and quietly walk out of the room. My granddaughter, Norton's daughter, plays the flute. One evening, my son called me on the telephone and asked me to hold the receiver and listen. I did. What did I hear? My granddaughter played the same melody I used to sing to her father when I put him to sleep. My son excitedly asked me whether I remembered this tune. I assured him that I did. At the same time, I asked him whether he remembered it. Oh, Mom, he answered. How can I forget it? It's still ringing in my ears. I will never forget it.
I love it. Yeah.
So some of the stories that my students write are priceless.
Yeah.
And they're really worth the effort.
And your classes run the whole year long, I guess.
Yeah, we have sort of like 2 semesters, and we don't have classes during the summer. And we meet every other week instead of every week. And that seems to work out well. Sometimes they're unable to finish writing their story during the class period. Mm-hmm. I usually introduce the class and speak maybe for a half hour, and then allow 45 minutes or so for writing. And if they don't finish it, they may take it back to their apartment and have it ready for the next class. So some of these have taken a little longer to write. But it's amazing, after 18 classes, what they've been able to do. Of course, not everybody comes to each class. You know, they have doctor's appointments and such. But it's really a joy to work with them. So we have a lot of fun together, sharing our stories.
Now, what about those? Are there any that, I know you said most of them are not genealogists. Are there any that are, and has that changed the way they write things or the way they look at things, or do they try to write further back?
I haven't had any real genealogists, but I've had some historians in my class, and they do very good work because they've had that training, and they try to fill in more of the background. For some people, it's very difficult to write anything other than being very factual. Mm-hmm. And I tell them that it's good to describe the atmosphere of your family when you were growing up, and how things were, and the role that different members of the family played, and what were some of the activities you did together. In my family, when Franklin Roosevelt gave a fireside chat, everything stopped, and we all went to the living room where we had a big radio that was, I believe, a Zenith, and floor model, and we would sit around the radio and listen to the president speak. And that is something I remember us doing together. And other families had other practices, and of course celebrating the Jewish holidays is always another great memory and a great thing to write about. How did your family celebrate Passover? And who conducted the Seder? Your father? Mm-hmm. And what did you do? Was it a long Seder? Did it go on, or was it a short Seder? We had a very interesting thing in my family. We used the Orthodox Haggadah, and it was a pretty long session. Mm-hmm. And when my sister got married, she married a fella whose uncle had started the Reformed synagogue in Uniontown. We belonged to an Orthodox synagogue. And the Reformed people have a shortened Haggadah. And so my sister brought this Reformed Haggadah to my father and showed him a copy.
That old gray one? That was very short.
He loved it. He thought that was really well done. Oh. It was a hardback book of about, 20 or 30 pages. And we started using the shortened service. And of course, that meant that we could eat a lot earlier. So that was very popular in my family. We went to an Orthodox synagogue, but we had a Reformed Passover Seder.
Well, I was raised Reformed, but we used German Haggadah because my parents had just come from Germany before I was born. And I was a teenager, and suddenly I rebelled, and I said, why are we still using this German one? And they thought it over, and they said, yeah, because it was 2 to 1. My sister and I couldn't read German. My grandmother didn't know the English, but we did switch to an English one, and it was the old Maxwell House coffee ones that you got for free. Everyone was a little bit, every year we collected them. But I guess everybody has those stories. You don't really think about them until, you're right. You need to have somebody prompt you a little bit to think of those stories.
Some of these stories in my family are just remarkable, and I didn't want them to be lost. And I guess my favorite story about my family is my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, Elias Terner, emigrated to America from Romania, but he didn't have time to plan his trip because he was in the Romanian army. Oh. And he had served in the Romanian army for 7 years. And that was the time he was supposed to get out. But a wealthy family whose son was going to be called bribed the Romanian army officers, and they were going to have my grandfather serve his second 7 years. Well, he wasn't about to put up with that. So he waited for an opportunity, and one day, I'm told, when the officers were at a meeting in the barracks was located next to a forest, he decided to make a run for it. And he felt if he could get to the denser part of the forest, the officers would have trouble following him because they were always on horseback. So he made a break for it, and he got to the edge of the forest, and just as he got there, one of the officers almost caught up with him. And he caught my grandfather with his saber on the cheek. Ooh. And I always noticed that scar that my grandfather had on his right cheek. And he was bleeding a bit from that, but he kept right on going, and he did make it home. Mm. And that's a story about how he escaped from the Romanian army and how he got to first Canada and then the United States. Was the favorite story of my granddaughter. She's been hearing some of these stories, and that's her favorite.
Well, I think that's awfully brave of him. That's a very interesting story. Of
course,
it puts it all into.
That story is preserved in that book.
Now, that was your grandfather?
That was my grandfather, my father's father.
And it's your granddaughter that likes the story. Yeah. I have a great-great-grandfather, I guess it'd be the same kind of distance, who served in Napoleon's army, and that seems so far away, and that's exciting to me, too. By the way, I want to take a moment and mention that this show will be on the web, and all of our TV shows now are on the web, you can see the entire show. So even though you live in Maryland, you can have your family watch it. You go to just tracingroots.nova.org, and that's our website, and you can look down. We've got a description of all of the shows that we've done, and there's a little box next to it that says "See Now," and you click on that, and it'll show the it'll come on and it'll show the whole show with the sound and everything. It's something that the newer technology has now allowed us to do, and it gives us a chance to let people around the country see the shows, which is something we had originally intended when we started this series. You've got a family portrait there.
Here's not a family portrait. This is just a picture of my class.
Oh, the class, okay.
And some of the people that helped me with the class at the Revitz house. But we have a lot of fun sharing our stories. And one of my students is Mac Postow, is 93 years old. And he wrote a wonderful story about his mother. He was telling about how his mother became a citizen. They were living in New York, and at that time you went to a court, and the judge would ask questions to determine whether you knew something about American history. And so her daughter had already been in America for a while and had gone to college and become a teacher. And so she worked with her mother, and her mother knew all the answers to a lot of the questions that they gave out to the immigrants. And so she was answering all these questions very, very quickly. And then she got to the question of who was the president, and she said Franklin Roosevelt. And she was very fond of Franklin Roosevelt. And he said, "What happens when the president dies?" And she said, "God forbid." The judge says, "You pass."
Yeah, well, that's cute.
So you get some interesting little sidelights. And you know, when you look at a family tree chart, it's sort of, unless you're really into it, it's sort of deadly to go through line by line. It's just names. But if you can make some of those names come alive, then it's, to me, it's really worthwhile. And I think that, I don't know how many of my descendants will be interested in looking at the family trees, but I think a lot of them will like the stories I've written.
Well, you know, if you said your granddaughter's already interested in this story about your grandfather, she's already gotten the bug to learn and take.
Well, she's only 8 years old, so I don't know, but
it's the start. It's the start. You know, she'll always remember that story, and at some point she'll become interested, hopefully, and want to learn a little bit more.
You know how grandfathers like to talk about their granddaughters, and she's our only grandchild so far. But that's her favorite. She told her mother, and her mother related to me. She liked that. I gave her mother one of these books, and she started reading her some of the tales.
No, I should do that with my granddaughter. She knows who her great-great-grandfather was. She's seen the picture, but should start reading that story to her and let her. But she's a little bit younger. She's probably a little bit too young for some of that. So there's a couple more minutes left. So I want to talk about any of these other specific things that you talk about. You do have topics of siblings and children and grandchildren. You mentioned important people in your life. You did mention the music and the radios and the neighborhood, how it had changed.
We had a lot of fun with talking about some of the modern things that didn't exist when they were kids. And a lot of people went to the New York World's Fair in 1939 and 1940. And I went with my family. And a lot of the people in my class enjoy talking about what the impact of going to the New York World's Fair was. It's an interesting subject. So we've tried that. And my favorite topic is how my family got through the Great Depression of 1929. Because I was born in 1929, and I have a lot of memories from that period. I remember people knocking on the back door of our house asking if they could have a plate of food. And they would do some chores for us. And my mother always sat them down and gave them a heaping plate of hot food. She never asked them to do any chores. She didn't want to take advantage of them. But the word got around, and many of these folks were riding the rails, and they were going from town to town looking for a job. You know, there weren't too many jobs available.
Yeah, well, that was the whole problem, I guess. That's
so I have those memories, and a lot of people in my class, a lot of my students remember things that happened during the Great Depression.
Well, thank you very much. It's been very interesting. It's made me think about my own life and my own genealogy and so on in a little bit different way, and think about what I can possibly do about it. Thank you very much.